Live from Nairobi, this is Focus on Africa on BBC News. Our top stories. A delegation of African leaders arrive in Ukraine amid a barrage of Russian missile attacks on a mission to end hostilities. We look back at relations between the continent and the two warring countries and ask, can the Africa peace mission succeed where others have failed? Budget bonanza or bust? A number of East African community countries say they'll spend more this financial year off the back of strong growth forecasts. Also in the program, first South Korea and then the rest of the world. K-pop sensation BTS weaved their musical magic into the lives of fans right across the continent. But when will they perform in Africa?
Because they have such a range of different styles, it's like really unique compared to other groups.
If they can just, come to Africa, it will be so amazing.
Many thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa. I'm Wahiga Mwaura. There have been several rounds of peace talks since Russia invaded Ukraine in February last year. None have stuck. Now, a delegation of African leaders are in the region with a new initiative. Today, leaders from 7 countries, led by South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, met with President Zelensky in Kyiv. They are due to hold talks with Vladimir Putin in Moscow tomorrow. The delegates were taken on a brief tour of the city with plenty of military hardware and vehicles on show. They arrived just a few hours after the Ukrainian military said the capital came under missile attack, with the Air Force shooting down more than a dozen rockets. Ukraine's foreign minister said the message to Africa was clear. Russia wants more war, not peace. And at this moment, we want to bring you some live pictures in Kyiv, where that Africa delegation led by President Cyril Ramaphosa has just come out of a meeting. And Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, is addressing those in attendance. Let's listen in.
To engage so that a peaceful solution is found. So we welcome President Zelensky's openness that there should be further engagements. And as African leaders, we stand ready and willing to have further engagements. Thank you very much.
Заява президента Республіки Сенегал.
All right. Well, what we know so far at this briefing is that President Macky Sall of Senegal is up next, but earlier on we were listening to South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, and we also know that President Zelensky also spoke. What Cyril Ramaphosa was saying in a nutshell, President of South Africa, he was thanking President Zelensky for being open to more engagements, and that's what this Africa Peace Initiative is pushing for at a time like this. Remember, from Ukraine, they make their way to Russia for a similar meeting with a similar agenda with President Vladimir Putin as well. A meeting that's been on the cards for a long time and is now happening, and we'll continue giving you updates. Now, earlier on, our correspondent, Mayeni Jones in Kyiv, explained more about this visit. This is what she had to say.
This delegation of 7 African countries is in the capital to meet President Zelensky. They'll be going to St. Petersburg to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow. And the key reason for this visit, they say, is because they want to make some suggestions to both countries that could maybe lead them towards coming to some sort of negotiated peace deal. They say that they have a vested interest in brokering peace between the two countries because the conflict has had a disproportionate effect on their economies. A number of African countries import grain from Ukraine and fertilizer from Russia, and the conflict has led to diminished supplies of both of these commodities. It's driven food prices up across Africa and worsened the hunger crisis in a number of countries there. The probability that both countries will come to the negotiating table is low. Ukraine and Russia believe that they can win this war militarily. But for many African countries, they see this as an opportunity to put forward some of their requests to the countries.
An earlier update from the BBC's Mayeni Jones. Now, in this rare diplomatic intervention from African leaders, many are wondering what brings on this unusual burst of activism, given Africa's largely hands-off approach to conflict outside of the continent. Well, my colleague Tom Hayden explains the importance of Africa's relationship with both Ukraine and Russia.
We speak with our African friends, trying to explain to them that neutrality is not the answer.
Far from the front lines of the Ukraine-Russia war, both countries have been fighting a proxy battle to charm the African continent and earn support for their relative sides. Eritrea and Mali have sided with Russia, whereas about half of African states have consistently voted on Ukraine's side. But in a February 2023 UN resolution calling for Russia to withdraw, of the 32 states to abstain, almost half of them were African. A further 6 didn't show up to the vote at all. The war has put many African countries in an awkward position, caught between Western-backed Ukraine and Russia, with whom many countries have historic ties. Many African nations have indeed refused to openly take sides.
We
have taken an abstentionist position, a position of neutrality, a position of non-alignment to prevent this conflict from spreading to other regions, notably the African continent.
But both Russia and Ukraine have been ramping up their efforts to woo African countries, with Putin and Zelensky's foreign ministers, Lavrov and Kuleba, being deployed on multiple wartime trips to the continent.
You and us are on the same page.
There are two things of huge importance in this charm offensive: the supply of grains and the flow of weapons. Ukraine and Russia are among the world's largest producers of both grains and fertilizers, crucial to the harvests of many countries on the continent. The question of weapons is a murkier issue. South Africa was recently accused of selling arms to Russia, which it subsequently denied. Even more telling, leaked US Pentagon documents obtained by the Washington Post suggested that Egypt had agreed to secretly sell 40,000 rockets to Russia, before appearing to backtrack and supply ammunition to Ukraine instead. Again, Egypt has denied this. But when it comes to diplomatic relations with Africa, the two nations have not started on equal footing. Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, can draw on much longer historical links with many African countries, especially those in which it directly provided military support during the decolonization era. And in countries like Mali and Central African Republic, ongoing military assistance through the Russia-backed Wagner Group mercenaries only deepens ties between the nations.
Our minister, we welcome you here with open arms. Russia is here at Mali's request, and Russia is responding effectively to Mali's needs in terms of building the capacity of our defense and security forces.
Ukraine, in contrast, has only 10 embassies across the continent, less than a quarter of Russia's presence. Ukraine is fundamentally trying to rally countries around the world to support its 10-point peace plan, calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops. But African nations are not remaining passive. Among recent efforts to mediate the war is a planned meeting by 6 African countries to end the stalemate.
Africa does need to put forward an initiative, a peace initiative that could help to contribute to the solution of that conflict.
With one voice, Africa's diplomatic weight could continue to shape the competition for support between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, to make more sense of this, earlier I spoke to Harry Kalaba, a former Foreign Affairs Minister of Zambia, one of the countries involved in the peace mission. I began by asking him why the leaders are getting involved in this particular war when there are pressing conflicts nearer to home.
The African Union has got a structure in which it operates. And you've mentioned the DRC Congo, you've mentioned Eritrea. There are already African methodologies or African initiatives being done in these parts of the world. I mean, when we talk about the DRC Congo, there's already IGAD, which has been dealing with issues there. Eritrea and Ethiopia, there are also issues around there, and there's a committee already also IGAD dealing with those issues there. So Africa has already got issues being dealt with, but the one we have right now of the Russia-Ukraine one is unique, and it requires a unique strategy. Remember that we all go in the international politics for our own interests, and so that interest is slowly being ravaged We see that supplies are not coming as they used to come as a result of the war. And leaders have realized that this is going to be an issue for them in their own individual countries and Africa as a whole. So the earlier they do this, the better. In fact, this should have been done some time back.
African leaders, by and large, have termed themselves as neutral in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but some have questioned some of their actions in regard to that. But why do you think they are making this peace mission now?
I think it is very, very important for the leaders to make this peace initiative, especially that most of Africa's wants are coming from that part of the world. I talk about fertilizer, I talk about human capital, I talk about military attire. Most of the things are coming from there, and with the war raging, it's becoming a problem for our continent to function properly.
Do you think African countries have the political leverage to be able to get an influential world leader like Putin to change his mind on this offensive, for example?
I think so, because as you know, President Putin, Russia in particular, have been trying to develop relations with Africa. There will be a Russia-Africa summit very soon. I think it should be in August. And all those initiatives, I think, can only be exacerbated if President Putin and Russia begin taking Africa seriously. And this is a test to see how President Putin will take Africa seriously on the advice that Africa will have given.
So what do you think these African leaders can tell the two leaders of Russia and Ukraine that other world leaders have not been able to over a year and a few months?
Well, you recall, you know very well that what is happening is that there is NATO on the other side and there is Russia on the other side, and it has been very difficult for peace to reign in there. But sometimes an independent voice coming from Africa to ceasefire, to talk about peace instead of war, I think is a breath of fresh air in the ears of Putin, just as well as Zelensky. And I think, strictly speaking, and I believe myself that this is a very important initiative which will yield its results. It might not be now, but even in future, it will yield results.
The absence of 3 presidents, is that anything to take note of? It was a 7-president delegation, now only 4. Should that concern anyone following this closely?
Well, I take note that President Museveni has not traveled because he's currently recuperating from COVID. I can only suspect that the other leaders from Egypt and the other country have not traveled also because of issues beyond them. But I think the intention is what is there. President Ramaphosa has traveled together with other leaders on the African continent. And I take it that it's not about a president being there, it's about a country being represented.
What would Africa's main benefit be if a resolution or ceasefire is achieved?
Well, the benefit that Africa will have achieved from this is that a lot of issues that are now stagnant as a result of the war in Ukraine and Russia will be freed up. I mean, finances will be freed up. We're talking about products coming from the two countries will also be freed up. And the ease of doing business will be exacerbated. So obviously, this is a must-do trip, and this is a trip that is going to be a game changer for Africa if indeed peace reigns.
And we now want to take you back to Kyiv and update you more on this ongoing news conference. African countries, of course, prepare to participate further in a peace pact in Ukraine with South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. Earlier, after that meeting between African leaders and President Zelensky in Kyiv, during which he called for a free flow of grain. President Zelensky also said that he'd invited African leaders to take part in a global peace summit and rejected the idea of peace talks with Moscow now, which he said would simply freeze the war in Ukraine. Let's just take that again. We're finally getting more and more information out of Kyiv, where the African leaders and that delegation have met with Ukraine's president, and they are now addressing members of the press on this. And this is a story we'll continue giving you more updates on as and when we get them. But still to come, a number of East African community countries say they'll spend more this financial year off the back of strong growth forecasts. We'll look at the numbers.
There is art all over Istanbul, but this has to be the strangest of all.
Music is such an important tool in our lives, not just to bring pleasure, but also to heal and to bring hope.
We're just in a period now that African brands are just owning that, owning what we have and projecting it in however they see fit.
I just love this place because this is somewhere where memory itself is set in stone.
This festival is all about light over darkness, the triumph of good over evil. And that idol over there, Kali, stands as a symbol of hope and power to everyone in the community.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC News.
You're a raver.
Do I look like a raver?
I've got bass in a backpack. This is amazing.
Dancing for like 4 or 5 hours of a gig, you could generate about 800 kilowatt hours of thermal energy.
Right, so shall we give it a taste? And it's my favourite.
We're really talking to the plants, and they're telling us how happy they are.
It can fly, but it can also float on water.
Oh my God, that came by quick. It's all about augmented reality.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful.
Totally and utterly immersed in another world there.
Your Tech Update. Click on BBC News.
Welcome back to Focus on Africa. Governments across the East African region plan to spend more money in the coming financial year of 2023-2024 to grow their economies. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania and Rwanda simultaneously tabled their budgets before their respective parliaments, which collectively amounts to about $63 billion, an increase from last year's $59 billion. The three big economies in the region, that's Kenya, Uganda and Tanzania, will borrow more than $12 billion, which is equivalent to the entire economy of Rwanda, one of the smallest countries in the region. Debt distress is becoming a significant concern for countries on the continent. The budgets come amid the increased pressures of the rising cost of living across the board as governments tackle the toll the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war have had on their economies. Now let's take a look at one of those countries, and Kenya's $26 billion spending plan comes amidst a controversial finance bill, which proposes a set of new taxes. The BBC's Jewel Kiriungi spoke with the chairperson of the Parliamentary Budget Committee, Ndindi Nyoro, to find out whether the government is responding to concerns by Kenyans who feel overburdened by the high cost of living.
The tax measures are both slight additions and also there is gross deductions on the other side. So we are trying to balance what is it that will make as many Kenyans take part in baking the cake, but also on the other side, on the expenditure side, we are looking at how can we craft a budget that promises and actualizes shared prosperity.
This year's budget will be the first under President William Ruto. What three things are different in this year's budget compared to the previous budget?
We laid down our plan that as we shepherd this country and the economy going forward, we are not going to dig deeper into the hole of borrowing. We have brought down the fiscal deficit from 6.2% of our GDP and brought that down to 4.4% of our GDP now. And in the medium term, next financial year, we project to take that lower to 3.6% of our GDP. That's one. Two, we are no longer throwing money into projects. We have recalibrated how we allocate public money. And we are now using the value chain approach. And we have started with value chains that will have the highest impact to our economy. So we are taking on this side, let me demonstrate. Cotton is one of our value chains. We are going to the farmer. We are giving them BT cotton seeds. Once they plant, we have allocated money in terms of ginaries. So that then you don't just throw money into cotton. After a bumper harvest of cotton, then you're stranded. We are going through the value chain, the entire. We can trace the input with the output. We can trace the entry point and the exit point. And that is what we are doing. And we have come up with 9 value chains around labor-intensive industries. Most of them have a component of agriculture coming to industry and exiting in terms of trade. Lastly, we are targeting areas. The last component we are doing differently, that brings about shared prosperity. In the recent past, we have seen GDP figures being reported, but Kenyans don't feel these GDP figures. In the policies that we are making, both in the finance bill and also in the budget, we are looking at employing as many Kenyans as possible. That is number one. Incorporating as many Kenyans to be part of the workforce. Incorporating as many Kenyans to be agents of the growth of the economy. So that when we report GDP figures, Kenyans can relate to these GDP figures.
All right, let's take you back to our top story. We continue to monitor the situation in Kyiv, in Ukraine, where that press briefing continues. President Zelensky addressing those who are present, and we'll continue to bring you pictures as and when we get them. Let's briefly listen in.
Are there going to be any other answers in this case? The next question from the BBC Africa, please.
Question is for President Ramaphosa. During your presentation, you said you believe in territorial sovereignty. You also mentioned you'll be going to St. Petersburg tomorrow to speak to President Putin. What do you intend to ask him about regarding the occupation of Russia of Ukrainian territories? How do you intend to convince him to perhaps deoccupy those positions? And for President Zelensky, you have said that, talking about grains in a time of war shows that perhaps your aims are different to some of the other people here. How do you intend to convince African countries that they should support Ukraine in its war effort?
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, as you correctly say, we are going to St. Petersburg. We are going to see President Putin. And in the key elements that I pointed out, I did say that as all of us here, we respect the UN Charter. For us, that is a very important and key charter that unites various countries of the world. And in our discussions with President Putin, we will be talking about the importance of the UN Charter. And we're not the first group that is calling for a peaceful settlement, that has articulated the issue of respect for the sovereignty of countries. Many others have, and so we are also reiterating what has been said. And another key element that I spoke to was that there should be security for all countries, and indeed both countries. They should have a sense of security that their own sovereignty and standing is also secured. And that's another key issue that also needs to be discussed. The quest for peace, in our view, is an important one. And the launching of the missiles today, in our view, does not deter us and has not stopped us from continuing to call for de-escalation. It is precisely this type of event that we saw today, or witnessed, or even experienced, that makes us call for de-escalation. And there are offensives on both sides, and we are saying those must be de-escalated as both countries proceed on the road to peace. And the road to peace is not an easy one. It's often a very difficult one. We also, from our own country, had to traverse that difficult road to peace. And even when the conflict becomes most intense, that is when peace should be made and be found. I specifically remember the efforts of the founding father of our democracy, President Mandela, who, even when he was in prison and apartheid was at its highest and its worst, he said this was the time for us to enter into negotiations to bring the nightmare of apartheid to an end. So we do believe that even at this stage, even as there's intensification of the conflict. There should be de-escalation, and there should be commitment to peace, and we should find ways of ensuring that indeed there's negotiations and there's also a movement towards settling this conflict. As we said, this conflict is also affecting African countries.
All right, and that is the press briefing ongoing right now in Kyiv, Ukraine. At this time, they're responding to a question there by the BBC's Mayeni Jones. The key message that's coming out of there is the African leaders say they're not undeterred in any way by the missiles that had early on been reported in Kyiv, but they're also looking forward to going to Russia tomorrow to speak to President Vladimir Putin. They believe the quest for peace is important. De-escalation on both sides must happen. The grains need to reach the necessary countries, and this is something we'll continue updating you on. But that's all from the program. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Wahiga Mwaura. Goodbye.